Take domestic violence seriously. And get out of the relationship. Escape if you can.
Love stories are supposed to have happy endings. They're supposed to be about two people finding each other, building a life together, creating something beautiful.
She loves animals. She loved her son. She was sweet. She was outgoing. She was free-spirited. We loved each other. She's my everything.
But sometimes, what starts as love becomes something else entirely. Sometimes, the person you think will protect you becomes the very person you need protection from.
Minneapolis police found her shot just feet from her own front door.
Mariah Samuels believed in second chances. She believed that people could change, that love could heal, that everyone deserved redemption.
Less than an hour before she was killed, Samuels wrote on her Facebook page that her ex-boyfriend had threatened her family, damaged her car, and she posted a video that she says shows him hitting her several times.
At 34 years old, this Minneapolis mother of two had a heart big enough to see past someone's mistakes and focus on their potential. When she met David Wright, a man who had just been released after spending 15 years behind bars, she didn't see a criminal. She saw someone who needed love, someone who deserved a fresh start. David had served his time. He had paid his debt to society. And when Mariah looked at him, she saw a man ready to build a new life. What she couldn't see were the warning signs that would soon emerge. What she couldn't predict was how quickly love would turn into obsession, how protection would become possession, and how her act of compassion would ultimately cost her everything. Stay tuned as we reveal everything about this case. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about this story. Welcome to our channel. Make sure to hit the subscribe button. Like and share this video to help raise awareness and spread caution. Let's begin.
The family of a Minneapolis woman killed in front of her home Sunday morning wants accountability.
34-year-old Mariah Samuels was a victim of domestic violence. And
the relationship between Mariah and David started like many modern relationships do. There was connection. There was chemistry. There was a belief that they could build something meaningful together.
By you being in my life, things were destined.
David had spent more than a decade incarcerated, and Mariah represented everything he had missed during those years. Freedom, love, the chance to be part of family. For Mariah, David represented something different. Here was a man who had been through the worst the justice system could offer and had come out the other side. Here was someone who understood struggle, who knew what it meant to lose everything and fight to get it back. In a world where genuine connection feels increasingly rare, David seemed like someone who would value what they had together. But love is complicated, especially when it involves people who have been shaped by trauma, by loss, by years of separation from normal life. What Mariah couldn't know was that David's years in prison hadn't just taken away his freedom. They had changed him in ways that would prove impossible to overcome. The man she fell in love with carried within him a darkness that would eventually consume everything good in their relationship. Mariah Samuels was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Friends and family describe her as someone who had an infectious laugh, a generous spirit, and unwavering commitment to the people she loved. At 34, she had built a life centered around her two children, who were everything to her. Being a mother wasn't just something she did. It was who she was at her core, could overcome obstacles, and that everyone had capacity to change if they really wanted to. When Mariah met David Wright, she saw all of these possibilities. David had just been released after serving 15 years in prison, more than a third of his adult life. For someone like Mariah, who believed in redemption and second chances, David's story wasn't a red flag. It was an opportunity to be part of someone's comeback story. David was articulate about his experiences. He talked about his time in prison not as something he was proud of, but as something he had learned from. He spoke about wanting to build a different kind of life, about being grateful for the chance to start over. For someone who had spent 15 years cut off from normal relationships, from family life, from the simple pleasures that most of us take for granted, meeting Mariah must have felt like winning the lottery. In the early days of their relationship, David was everything Mariah could have hoped for. He was attentive without being overwhelming, interested in her life and her children, grateful for every moment they spent together. He seemed to understand how precious the second chance was, and he acted like someone who would never take it for granted. For Mariah, who had been raising her children largely on her own, the idea of having a true partner was incredibly appealing. Someone who understood struggle, who wouldn't take their relationship for granted, who was grateful for the chance to be part of family. It all seemed perfect. David's past wasn't something to overlook. It was proof that he understood the value of what they were building together. David entered prison as a young man and emerged as someone fundamentally changed by the experience. 15 years is enough time for entire ways of thinking to become ingrained, for survival mechanisms to become permanent parts of someone's personality. In prison, relationships are often about power and control. Trust is dangerous. Showing vulnerability can be deadly. These lessons don't just disappear when someone walks through the gates to freedom. When the honeymoon period of his relationship with Mariah began to fade, the real David Wright started to emerge. The gratitude and humility that had initially attracted Mariah were gradually replaced by demands and expectations. David began to show signs of possessive behavior that would eventually escalate into something much more dangerous. It started small, the way these things always do. David wanted to know where Mariah was going when she left the house. He wanted details about her conversations with friends, with co-workers, with family members. He began expressing jealousy about the time she spent with her children, about her friendships, about any aspect of her life that didn't directly involve him. Mariah initially interpreted these behaviors through the lens of David's experiences. He had been isolated from normal relationships for so long that his possessiveness seemed understandable. She thought he just needed time to adjust, to learn how to trust, to understand that love didn't mean ownership. She was patient with his questions, accommodating of his need for reassurance, understanding of his insecurities. But David's behavior continued to escalate. He began monitoring Mariah's phone, checking her messages, demanding to know about every conversation she had. He started showing up at her workplace unexpectedly, claiming he wanted to surprise her, but really checking on her activities. He began isolating her from friends and family, creating conflicts and drama that made it easier for Mariah to just avoid situations that would upset him. Mariah found herself walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring her own behavior to avoid triggering David's anger or jealousy. She began changing her routines, limiting her social interactions, making excuses for David's behavior to friends and family who were starting to express concern. The confident, independent woman who had first attracted David was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone who was constantly anxious about his reaction to her choices. The most dangerous aspect of David's behavior was how he convinced Mariah that she was responsible for his reactions. When he became jealous, it was because she had been too friendly with someone else. When he became angry, it was because she hadn't communicated effectively. When he became controlling, it was because she hadn't given him enough reason to trust her. This psychological manipulation made it almost impossible for Mariah to recognize that she was being abused. When Mariah finally recognized that what she had interpreted as love was actually something much more dangerous, David's possessiveness had evolved into outright stalking, and his emotional abuse had escalated to the point where Mariah feared for her safety and the safety of her children. David's surveillance of Mariah's activities had become constant and invasive. He would follow her to work, show up at places where she was supposed to be meeting friends, and monitor her online activities obsessively. He had inserted himself into every aspect of her life to such a degree that Mariah felt like she was living under constant observation. The relationship that had started with promises of partnership had become a prison of David's making. The stalking behavior extended beyond just monitoring Mariah's movements. David began contacting her friends, family members, and co-workers, ostensibly to check on Mariah, but actually to gather information about her activities and to send a message that he was always watching. He would call her repeatedly throughout the day, demanding to know exactly what she was doing and who she was with. When she didn't answer immediately, he would become increasingly aggressive and threatening. Mariah's children were also affected by David's behavior. He would question them about their mother's activities, try to turn them against her friends and family members, and create an atmosphere of tension and fear in a home that no child should have to endure. For Mariah, Seeing the impact of David's behavior on her children was a wake-up call that she couldn't ignore. Recognizing the danger she was in, Mariah made the brave decision to seek legal protection. She went to court and obtained restraining orders against David, legally prohibiting him from contacting her or coming near her home, workplace, or children. For many domestic violence victims, taking this step represents a moment of incredible courage because it often triggers in an act of extraordinary courage. Mariah decided to make her ordeal public. She began sharing her story, talking openly about David's stalking and harassment, about the failures of the systems that were supposed to protect her, about the reality of trying to escape from an abusive relationship with someone who refused to accept that it was over. Mariah's decision to go public about her abuse was motivated by several factors. She wanted to document David's behavior in case something happened to her. She wanted to warn other women about the danger he posed. And she wanted to shed light on how inadequate the current systems are for protecting domestic violence victims from determined abusers. What do you think about Mariah's decision to share her story publicly? Have you ever supported someone who was trying to escape from an abusive relationship? Let me know in the comments. Because Mariah's courage in speaking out, even when it put her at greater risk, shows us how important it is for communities to support and believe victims when they tell us they're in danger. Through social media posts, conversations with friends, and reports to law enforcement, Mariah created a public record of David's escalating behavior. She documented his violations of the restraining orders, his continued threats, his refusal to accept that their relationship was over. She was essentially creating evidence that she hoped would protect her, but that would ultimately serve as a record of how the systems designed to help domestic violence victims had failed her. Despite the restraining orders, despite the public documentation of his behavior, despite the clear evidence that David posed a serious threat to Mariah's safety, he remained free to continue his harassment. The legal system had provided Mariah with papers that were supposed to protect her, but it had not provided her with actual safety. The end came on what should have been an ordinary evening outside Mariah's home in Minneapolis.
A woman was shot and killed just minutes after posting about the domestic violence she was facing. Family members say 34-year-old Mariah Samuels lost her life this weekend to that violence.
She had just returned from work, probably thinking about dinner with her children, maybe looking forward to a quiet evening without the constant stress of wondering where David was or what he was planning. For just a moment, she might have felt something approaching normalcy. But David had been watching, waiting for his opportunity. He had positioned himself where he could observe Mariah's routine, learn her patterns, and choose the moment when she would be most vulnerable. The man who had once promised to protect her had become the person she most needed protection from, and he had decided that if he couldn't have her, no one could. The sound of gunshots shattered the neighborhood where Mariah had been trying to build a safe life for herself and her children. Neighbors who rushed to help found a scene of devastating violence. A woman who had done nothing more than try to protect herself from an abusive ex-partner, lying mortally wounded outside her own home. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do to save Mariah's life. David's attack had been designed to kill, and he had succeeded in destroying the woman who had once seen so much potential in him, the mother who had worked so hard to provide for her children, the woman who had believed in second chances and redemption, the victim who had tried so desperately to use the legal system to protect herself. She was gone. David Wright was arrested shortly after the shooting. The man who had spent 15 years in prison was now facing charges that would likely put him away for the rest of his life. But for Mariah's children, for her family and friends, for everyone who had tried to help her escape from David's control, his arrest was cold comfort. The system had failed Mariah when she needed it most, and no amount of justice after the fact could bring her back. The scene outside Mariah's home became a crime scene, marked off with police tape and filled with investigators trying to piece together exactly what had happened. But the story was tragically simple. A woman had tried to escape from an abusive relationship, and the man who claimed to love her had killed her rather than let her go. Mariah Samuels' death represents more than just one tragic case. It's a stark illustration of the systemic failures that continue to put domestic violence victims at risk every single day across the country. Her story teaches us critical lessons about the nature of abusive relationships, the inadequacies of our current protection systems, and the warning signs that all of us need to recognize and take seriously. When Mariah obtained restraining orders and made her abuse public, She wasn't just seeking protection. She was asserting her fundamental right to control her own life. For someone like David, whose entire sense of identity had become wrapped up in controlling Mariah, this assertion of independence represented an intolerable threat that he was willing to kill to eliminate. Mariah's decision to make her abuse public was incredibly brave, but also illustrates how isolated domestic violence victims often feel. She felt compelled to document David's behavior and share her story because she understood that the formal systems designed to protect her were inadequate. She was essentially crowdsourcing her own protection by making her community aware of the danger she faced. Mariah Samuels should still be alive today. She should be watching her children grow up, celebrating their achievements, building the future she worked so hard to create. Instead, she became another statistic in our country's ongoing domestic violence crisis, killed by a man who claimed to love her but saw her as property he owned rather than a person with the right to make her own choices. Her story is not just a tragedy. It's a call to action. Every one of us has a responsibility to recognize the warning signs of domestic violence, to support victims when they reach out for help, and to demand better from the systems that are supposed to protect vulnerable people. Mariah's courage in speaking out about her abuse, even when it put her at greater risk, shows us the importance of believing victims when they tell us they're in danger. Her death shows us the cost of failing to take those warnings seriously. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. Share this video to help spread awareness about these critical issues, and let me know in the comments how we can better support domestic violence victims in our communities. Subscribe for more stories that matter, and remember, Mariah's voice was silenced, but her story can still save lives.